Achilles, shining Achilles, godlike Achilles. How the epithets pile up. We never called him any of those things. We called him the Butcher. I heard him before I saw him, his battle cry ringing round the walls of Lyrnessus. We women, children too, of course, had been told to go to the citadel. Like all respectable married women, I rarely left my house, though admittedly, in my case, a house was a palace. So to be walking down the street in broad daylight felt like a holiday. Almost. Under the laughter, I think we were all afraid. I know I was. We could hear shouts, cries, the clash of swords on shields, and we knew what awaited us if the city fell. Down all the narrow lanes of the city, small groups of women carrying babies were converging on the main square. Fierce sunlight and the citadel's black shadow reaching out to take us in. The common women and slaves were herded into the basement, while the royal and aristocratic families occupied the top floor. All the way up the twisting staircase we went, until at last we came out abruptly into a big, bare room. As the sun rose higher, it became hot and stuffy, airless. The women kept looking at each other as outside the shouts and cries grew louder, and a great hammering on the gates began. Again and again, that battle cry rang out. For once, women with sons envied those with daughters because girls would be allowed to live. Boys were routinely slaughtered. Even pregnant women were sometimes killed, speared through the belly on the off chance their child would be a boy. I noticed Ismene, 4 months pregnant with my husband's child, pressing her hands into her stomach, trying to convince herself the pregnancy didn't show. In the past few days, I'd often seen her looking at me. Ismene, who'd once been so careful never to meet my eyes, and her expression had said more clearly than any words, "It's your turn now. Let's see how you like it." I came from a family where slaves were treated kindly, and when my father gave me in marriage to my niece, the king, I carried on the tradition in my own home. I'd been kind to Ismene, but perhaps no kindness was possible between owner and slave, only varying degrees of brutality. Nobody was talking of defeat, though we all expected it. But then that war cry came again and again, each time closer, and we all knew who it was, though nobody said his name. The air was heavy with the foreknowledge of what we would have to face. Ritza leant across to me. "Well, at least we're not virgins." She was grinning as she said it. I nodded and forced a smile, but said nothing. As the heat intensified, most of the women settled down and tried to sleep. Then Achilles' war cry came again. So close this time, some of the women sat up and gazed fearfully around them. We all knew we were approaching the end. An hour later, hearing the crash and splinter of wood breaking, I ran up onto the roof, leant over the parapet, and saw Greek fighters spilling through a breach in the gates. They were pouring through the breach, slashing and stabbing as they came. Soon that peaceful square was trampled red with blood. I saw Achilles raise his plumed head and look towards the palace steps where my husband stood with 2 of my brothers by his side. The next thing I saw was Achilles hacking his way towards them. My youngest brother, 14 years old. I saw him die. I saw the flash of the upraised spear. I saw my brother lying on the ground, wriggling like a stuck pig. And at that moment, Achilles, as if he had all the time in the world, turned his head and glanced up at the tower. He was looking straight at me, or so it seemed. I think I actually took a step back. but the sun was in his eyes. He couldn't possibly have seen me. Then, with a kind of fastidious precision, he put his foot on my brother's neck and pulled the spear out. My husband, poor silly Mynes, fought bravely to defend his city. He died with both hands gripping Achilles' spear as if he thought it belonged to him and Achilles was trying to take it away. My 2 older brothers died beside him. For the first and only time in my life, I was glad my mother was dead. Every man in the city died that day. I saw Achilles, blood red from his plumed helmet to his sandaled feet, laughing in triumph. His spear trailing behind him cut a line through the red earth. When there were no men left to kill, the looting began. Men like columns of red ants passed goods from hand to hand. Carved furniture, bales of rich cloth, tapestries, armour, barrels of wine and grain. And then they turned their attention to us. The slave women in the basement were dragged out first. Still watching from the roof, I saw a woman raped repeatedly by a gang of men who were sharing a wine jug, passing it good-naturedly from hand to hand while waiting their turn. By now, all the women had come up to the roof and were huddled together. We could hear laughter as the Greeks crowded up the stairs. Ariana, my cousin on my mother's side, grasped my arm, saying without words, "Come." And then she climbed onto the parapet, and at the exact moment they burst onto the roof, threw herself down, her white robe fluttering round her as she fell. Her cry faded to a stricken silence in which, slowly stepping out in front of the other women, I turned to face the men. They stared at me, uneasy, like puppies who aren't sure what to do with a rabbit they've caught in their jaws. Then a white-haired man introduced himself as Nestor, king of Pylos. He bowed courteously, and I thought that probably for the last time in my life, somebody was looking at me and seeing Briseis, the queen. "Don't be frightened," he said. "Nobody's going to hurt you." I just wanted to laugh. A boy clung to his mother's skirt until one of the fighters bent down and prized his pudgy fingers loose. We heard him screaming, "Mummy, Mummy," all the way down the stairs. Then silence. Keeping my face carefully expressionless, I looked at Nestor and thought, I will hate you till my last breath. After that, it's a blur. We were led away through the narrow side streets to the beach. We took a last look at the city. Most of the houses and temples were ablaze. A short voyage. The ship turned into the shelter of a huge bay. I saw hundreds of black-beaked predatory ships, more than I'd ever seen in my life. We were driven up the beach and across a wide open space towards a row of huts. We were lined up and inspected. A few of us were singled out and pushed into a particular hut. Then they went out, bolting the door behind them. In the morning, I was the first out. I kept my eyes cast down. Nestor came up and spoke to me, pompous, though not unkind. "Don't think about your previous life," he said. "That's all over now. Forget. This is your life now." Forget? So there was my duty laid out in front of me. Remember. I shut my eyes. The men were shouting, "Achilles! Achilles!" Then a roar went up and I knew he was there. A hand seized hold of my chin and turned my head from side to side. I tried to open my eyes, but the sun hurt too much, and by the time I'd forced them open, he was already walking away. At the center of the arena, he stopped and raised both hands above his head until the shouting died away. "Cheers, lads," he said. "She'll do." And everyone, every single man in that vast arena laughed. Immediately, 2 guards appeared and took me to Achilles' hut, into a poky little room at the back, hardly bigger than a cupboard. There I was simply abandoned. Shaking with cold and shock, I sat down on a narrow bed. I heard footsteps approaching. A tall man came into the room, carrying a tray with food and wine. "Briseis," he said. I nodded. "Patroclus." I recognized the name. Achilles' closest companion, his second in command. But why would such a powerful man be waiting on a slave? "Drink," he said. "It'll make you feel better." He poured a generous measure and held out the cup. I took it and made a show of raising it to my lips. "Nobody's going to hurt you." I stared at him, but I couldn't speak. After a while, he gave a lopsided grin, put the tray down, and left. From the hall came a rumble of men's voices, more shouting, more laughter, songs. At last, I got up and went to the door. It wasn't locked. They knew I had nowhere to go. I tiptoed along the short passage and peered into the half-darkness. 2 trestle tables ran the whole length of a long, narrow hall. Men jostled as they reached out to impale hunks of meat on their daggers. Achilles and Patroclus had their backs to me, but I could see how frequently they glanced at each other. Achilles pushed his plate away and got to his feet. He raised his hands and said something about not wanting to break up the party, but he was laughing as he spoke. Then somebody shouted, "We all know why you want an early night." I crept back to the cupboard and closed the door, but then as the singing went on, I opened it again, just enough to be able to see into Achilles' room. Men's voices, Patroclus followed by Achilles, who threw his arm across his friend's shoulders. They talked about having another drink, but then Achilles nodded to the door where I was standing and flared his eyes. Patroclus laughed. "Oh yes, she's there." I stepped back, pressing my hands together to stop them trembling. Seconds later the door opened, and Achilles' huge shadow blotted out the light. He didn't speak, just jerked his thumb at the other room. Shaking, I got up and followed him. What can I say? He wasn't cruel. I waited for it, expected it even, but there was nothing like that. He fucked as quickly as he killed. And for me it was the same thing. Something in me died that night. Immediately I was anxious. Should I have been up before him, getting his breakfast, perhaps? But then I thought, Achilles would have many slaves, all with different functions, weaving, cooking, preparing his bath. I'd be told soon enough what was expected of me. Cautiously, I ventured out onto the veranda, and from there on to the sand. And then, barefoot, I set off to find the sea. I stumbled upon a path that seemed to lead away from the huts, down to the beach. At the back of my mind was the fear. Suppose he comes back and I'm not there. Beyond the roiling waves were the souls of my dead brothers. Again and again, behind my closed lids, I watched my youngest brother die. There, on that wind-swept beach, I heard him calling me, as lost and beyond help as I was myself. With no idea in my head except to reach him, I began wading into the sea, ankles, calves, thighs, and then the sudden cold shock as a huge wave picked me up and threatened to sweep me out of my depth, and I thought, why not? But then I heard a voice, a man's voice, though I couldn't make out the words, and suddenly I was afraid. I told myself the voice must be coming from the camp, but then I heard it again, and this time I knew it was out there. The drifting veils of mist momentarily parted, and I saw human arms and shoulders, the gleam of moonlight on wet skin. More splashing, and then abruptly silence, as he turned and lay face down on the water, drifting with the tide. Men on this coast don't learn to swim. They know swimming serves only to prolong a death that might otherwise be quick. But this man had been playing, like a dolphin. Suddenly he raised his head and floated upright. Seeing his face came as a shock, though it shouldn't have done because I'd guessed already who it was. I began to wade fast towards the shore. As I stepped onto dry land, I felt a quick, sharp stab of pain in my right foot. Something, a stone or a fragment of broken shell, was sticking into the sole of my foot, and I had to bend down and pull it out. When I looked up again, I saw Achilles. I squatted down, held my breath. He passed by without seeing me. Then he just stood on the tide line, facing out to sea. When he spoke, I thought he was speaking to me, but he seemed to be arguing with the sea or pleading. The only word I understood was mummy, and that made no sense at all. But then he said it again. Mummy, mummy, like a small child crying to be picked up. Whatever it meant, I knew I shouldn't be hearing it, but I didn't dare move, and so I crouched down and waited for it to stop. The mist was beginning to burn off as the sun rose. I saw the first golden gleams of light find his wet arms and shoulders as he walked along the beach, disappearing into the shadow of his black ships. I ran as fast as I could through the dunes, but once inside the camp I was lost. I stood there, wet, bedraggled and terrified. A girl beckoned me inside one of the huts. Her name, she said, was Iphis. She took care of me, even filling a bath with hot water to wash the salt out of my hair. As I prepared to step into the bath, something fell to the floor. The stone from the beach. When I drew it across my wrist, exerting scarcely any pressure, it left a wheal, beaded along its length with pinpricks of blood. So many pebbles on that beach, all of them worn smooth by the sea's relentless grinding, but not this one. This one had stayed sharp. I slipped the stone inside my girdle where it would press against my skin every time I moved. It mattered to me, that obstinate little stone, and it still does. I have it here now, on the palm of my hand. What I remember most, apart from the terror of the first few days, is a curious mixture of riches and squalor. Achilles dined off gold plate, slept under bed covers embroidered with gold and silver thread, and yet the latrine stank to high heaven and was covered in a pelt of black, buzzing flies, and the rubbish tip was a breeding ground for rats. Rats everywhere. Gradually a routine began to emerge. My only real duty was to wait on Achilles and his captains at dinner. At first I couldn't understand why, but then I remembered I was his prize of honour, so of course he wanted to show me off. I hated serving drinks at dinner, though of course it didn't matter to Achilles whether I hated it or not, and curiously it soon stopped mattering to me. This is what free people never understand. A slave isn't a person who's being treated as a thing. A slave is a thing, as much in her own estimation as in anybody else's. Achilles sat at his table with Patroclus. Theirs was not a relationship of equals, though Achilles always framed his orders courteously. Only that wasn't the whole story. Once I saw them walking together on the beach, Patroclus resting his hand on the nape of Achilles' neck, the gesture a man will sometimes make to a younger brother or a son. Nobody else in the army could have done that to Achilles and lived. The last part of the evening, after dinner, I spent in the company of Iphis, who was Patroclus's girl, given to him by Achilles. We used to sit on the bed in the cupboard and wait to be summoned. Patroclus sent for her most evenings, which was scarcely surprising given her delicate beauty. She knew she was lucky to have been given to Patroclus, who was always kind. Achilles had no curiosity about me, no sense of me as a person distinct from himself. When at dinner I put food or drink in front of him, he never once glanced up. He didn't speak to me, he didn't see me, but he sent for me every night. One night after dinner, instead of going to sit with Iphis waiting to be summoned, I went down to the sea. When I reached the beach, I walked straight into the sea as I usually did, but this time I kept on walking until the water closed over my head. But it's amazing how the body struggles to survive, even when the spirit's ready to depart. Involuntarily, I thrust upwards, breaking the surface with a shriek of indrawn air. When I got back to Achilles' compound, Iphis was waiting for me. I was shaking as she pulled a dry tunic over my head. All the while she was muttering with concern, but then Patroclus called for her and she had to go. In the next room, Achilles was playing the lyre as he always did at this time of night. I listened, and then he stopped playing. A minute later he opened the door and jerked his head for me to come in. I slipped between the sheets. He was in no hurry, picking up the lyre and playing the same sequence of notes again. I listened, hating the delicacy of his fingers as they moved across the strings. He did eventually get into bed. I closed my eyes, felt him turn onto his side and cup those terrible hands round my breasts. I forced myself not to pull away, and then he stopped. "What's that smell?" Those were almost the first words he'd spoken to me. I was aware of the smell of sea rot in my hair. I fully expected him to kick me out of bed or hit me. What he actually did was far more shocking. Groaning, he buried his face in my hair, then moved across my skin. When he started sucking my nipples, I arched my back with the shock of it, because this wasn't a man making love to a woman. This was a starving baby. When it was over, he seemed bewildered. I tensed, expecting him to hit me simply because I'd witnessed his need. Instead, he turned on his side and pretended to be asleep. Everything changed after that night, and not for the better. Instead of Achilles' brisk, efficient use of my body, there was immense passion. Passion, but no tenderness. One moment he was grinding me into the dust, the next clinging onto me as if afraid I might suddenly disappear. Gradually, I got to know the other prizes. Hecamede was about 19, more or less the same age as me. She'd been presented to Nestor as his prize for strategic thinking, since he was too old to take part in the actual raid. "Too old for anything?" I ventured. Uza hooted with laughter. "Don't you bloody well believe it. They're always the worst, old men." Uza was Odysseus's prize. No problems there, apparently. "They all talk about their wives," she said, stifling a yawn. It was never made clear what Uza's profession had been before, though I felt I could hazard a guess. Ritza turned to me. "What about Achilles? What's he like?" "Fast," I said, and left it at that. I was glad to see Ritza had been awarded to Machaon, the army's chief physician, not so much for her looks, but because of her skill in healing. The youngest of us, Chryseis, was 15, the daughter of a priest. Agamemnon couldn't get enough of her. "Never sends for anybody else," Uza said. "I'm amazed she's not pregnant." "He prefers the back door," Ritza said. She'd know. Ritza had a jar of goose fat mixed with roots and herbs that the common women round the campfires relied on if they'd had a particularly rough night. She was too discreet to reveal that Chryseis had been to see her, but the implication was obvious. "All she has to do is give him a son," said Briseis, "and that's it, made for life." "Mightn't that be a bit difficult?" I asked, "if he prefers the back door?" A ripple of laughter. It seems incredible to me now, looking back, that we laughed, but we often did. I'd always believed I wouldn't get pregnant. After all, 5 years of marriage had failed to produce a much-needed son, but then it's a well-known fact that a barren mare will sometimes foal if she's covered by a different stallion. One evening, when Iphis and I were waiting in the cupboard, Patroclus came in and said, "Why don't you come in?" We got up and followed him into the other room. I sat on a chair and sipped sweet wine. I hardly dared breathe. Achilles looked momentarily surprised, but otherwise paid us no attention. When Patroclus left, taking Iphis with him, I got into bed as usual. By now I'd worked out that the alteration in Achilles' behaviour was connected to the smell of seawater in my hair. I tried to stay away from the beach, but I needed that immersion in the cold, unforgiving depths. So I went on, coming to his bed with the tightness of salt on my skin, and braced myself to face his lust and his need, understanding none of it. The old man, Chryseis' father, Apollo's priest, walked into the centre of the arena, holding aloft the staff and scarlet bands of the god. First he greeted Agamemnon courteously, praying that Apollo and all the gods would grant him victory, that he'd be able to sack Priam's city and carry the riches of Troy home in his ships. "Only give me back my daughter." The priest seemed to be overwhelmed with grief, but then he forced himself to go on. He'd brought a great ransom with him. In the hold of the cargo ship they could all see anchored in the bay. Openly crying now, he begged Agamemnon to accept it. "Please, Lord Agamemnon, please let me take her home." Everybody in the arena was moved by the old man's tears and by the size of the ransom he'd brought with him. Soon the crowd was chanting, "Give her back! Give her back!" Agamemnon stood up. The chanting shriveled into silence. "Old man," Agamemnon said, "I'm not going to give her back. She'll spend the rest of her life in my palace, bearing my children until she's an old woman without a tooth in her head. Now get out!" In silence, the priest turned away. The crowd began to disperse, walking away in groups, muttering. Nobody liked it. I began to walk back to Achilles' compound. I cut down onto the beach, and there was the priest. He was making slow progress, crying and praying to Apollo as he went. "Lord of light, hear me. Lord of the silver bow, hear me." Sky and sea darkened around him, and still the chanting went on. "Lord, whose arrows strike from afar, hear me. Lord of mice, hear me." I'd forgotten that Apollo was the god of mice, and suddenly I knew where all these prayers were leading. Apollo's the lord of mice because mice, like rats, carry the plague. And Apollo, the lord of light, the lord of music, the lord of healing, is also the god of plague. As the priest's great prayer for vengeance mounted to the skies, I found myself praying with him. "Lord of mice, hear me. Lord of the silver bow, hear me. Lord whose arrows strike from afar, hear me." Until finally, the forbidden words erupting from my mouth like blood or bile. "God of plague, hear me." Next morning, walking along a path through the dunes, at one point skirting the vast rubbish dump, I walked past a rat, staggering in circles. But then something made me turn, and at that moment the rat screamed. Blood erupted from its mouth. It fell onto its side, rolled around in agony for a full minute, screamed again, and died. I noticed other rats then, bloated little corpses scattered here and there among the rubbish. In the hall at dinner, the talk was still about Agamemnon's treatment of the priest. A ransom like that for a girl, and he turned it down? Even Achilles was talking about Agamemnon's refusal of the ransom. Why didn't he take it? He's the greediest man alive. Perhaps he loves her, Patroclus said. Love? Bloody old goat doesn't know what love is. And you do, I thought, moving on. I was starting to see some of the men as individuals. Most of them tolerable, one or two of them definitely not. Myron was a middle-aged, corpulent man with a mass of coarse black hair. His job was to oversee the maintenance of the ships. He was a man I disliked. He stared at my breasts as I bent over him and made little smacking noises with his lips. That night I poured his wine, quickly, as I always did, because I hated being near him. And then I noticed the tunic he was wearing. It was one I'd woven for my father. Love had gone into every stitch. I looked down at the fleshy folds in Myron's neck, and once again the prayer sounded in my mind. Lord of mice, hear me. Lord of the silver bow, hear me. Lord whose arrows strike from afar, hear me. God of plague, hear me. After the dinner dishes had been cleared away, I went outside and found Patroclus sitting on the veranda steps, alone. Immediately I started to go back inside, but he motioned me to sit beside him. Achilles had gone for a swim, he said. For a while, neither of us spoke. But then the heat, the silence, the darkness of the night seemed to bring the impossible within reach. I heard myself say, "Why are you always so nice to me?" At first I thought he wasn't going to reply, that I had gone beyond what was permissible in a slave. But then he said, "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and be handed to Achilles as a toy." His honesty winded me. "When I was 10, I killed a boy," he said. "I didn't mean to do it. He was my best friend, but we fell out over a game of dice. He said I was cheating, and I hit him. He fell down, and I thought, that was it. I'd actually started to walk away, but then he jumped up and headbutted me, broke my nose. I was in so much pain I couldn't think. I just grabbed a stone and hit him with it. I only remember doing it once, but other boys there said I went on hitting him. By the time they pulled me off him, he was dead. His father was a powerful man, so I was sent into exile, shipped off to stay with Peleus, Achilles' father, not just for a few months either, forever. And there was Achilles. I don't think I'd ever seen a more miserable boy. His mother had just left. He hesitated. "You know she's a sea goddess." I nodded. "It wasn't a happy marriage. One day she just got up and walked into the sea. Achilles wouldn't eat, wouldn't play. I think he actually stopped growing. Peleus was at his wit's end, so I came in very handy because I had to be Achilles' friend." He laughed. I felt, rather than saw him turn towards me. "I hear you crying sometimes. I'm sure you never cried. Every night for a year." This was said so lightly it was hard to tell if he was being serious or not. I nodded towards the beach. A long swim. She might be there. For a moment I didn't understand. "You mean his mother?" "Yes." "She still comes to see him?" "Oh, yes." "I heard him once," I said, talking to her. I couldn't understand what he was saying. I waited. When he didn't comment, I said, "Are they close?" "Hard to say. She left when he was 7. He was smiling. "You remind him of her?" I remind him of his mother. You should be flattered. She is a goddess. I'm trying. You know, I could make him marry you. I shook my head. Men don't marry their slaves. It's been known. He could marry a king's daughter. He could, but equally he doesn't need to. Mother a goddess, father a king, he can please himself. A sigh, caught and held. We could all sail home together. I wanted to say, you burned my home. Patroclus sat motionless for a minute or two before suddenly slapping his knees. I think I might have a walk down, see what he's up to. But after that conversation, I couldn't settle. I decided to walk a little way along the path that led to the beach. I came out at the place where the stream meandered over a pebbly bed towards the sea. Achilles and Patroclus were on the far side. I thought from their gestures they might be quarrelling. Once Achilles turned his back and Patroclus grabbed his arm and wrenched him round again. For a moment they stood facing each other, not speaking. Then Achilles moved in closer till he was resting his head against Patroclus's forehead. They stayed like that, without moving or speaking, for a long time. I stepped back into the shadows. I knew I'd stumbled on something too private to be witnessed. There were always those then and later who believed Achilles and Patroclus were lovers. Theirs was a relationship that invited speculation. Agamemnon in particular couldn't leave it alone. And perhaps they were lovers, or had been at some stage. But what I saw on the beach that night went beyond sex, and perhaps even beyond love. I didn't understand it then, and I'm not sure I do now. But I recognized its power. Next morning, when I passed the rubbish dump, there were too many dead rats to count. Myron was responsible not only for the maintenance of the ships, but also for the upkeep of the compound. Every rat that died in the open was dying on one of his paths. Of course, he had a whole squad of men to clear them away, but often he picked up the dead rats himself, as if he couldn't bear the sight of them a second longer. That night, 10 minutes into dinner, Myron, streaming with sweat, began clawing at his throat and armpits. The other men teased him. Got fleas, Myron. This was a joke. Everybody had fleas. Myron was in no mood for jokes. He got to his feet and started for the door. Thinking he'd taken offence, one of the men shouted after him, "Oh, sit down, Myron, have a drink." I don't think Myron heard. He was tearing at his throat and armpits. He even put a hand up his tunic and started clawing at his groin. One or two of the men began to look uneasy. Clearly something was wrong. Myron slumped against the wall and fell headlong on the floor. Then Patroclus was kneeling beside him. The crowd parted to let Achilles through. He too knelt and pressed his fingers into the fleshy jowls round Myron's jaw. "Feel that," he said in a whisper to Patroclus. Patroclus put his hand on Myron's neck and nodded. Hard. Achilles reached down the front of Myron's tunic to feel his armpits, then looked at Patroclus and, almost imperceptibly, shook his head. As Achilles' kinsman, Myron was given a dignified funeral. His rotten carcass, oiled and perfumed and dressed in my father's tunic, was carried to the pyre with all the proper ceremonies and prayers. But when the fighters began to disperse, the talk was all of other men who'd fallen sick. 5 of them on the day Myron died. Soon the arrows of Apollo were striking thick and fast. Men were dying in such numbers that funerals could no longer be dignified rituals. On the 9th day, Achilles and Patroclus returned from a particularly distressing cremation. Patroclus slumped in his chair. Achilles began pacing up and down. "Why doesn't Agamemnon call an assembly? If he won't, I will." Patroclus swished wine round his cup and drank. Achilles looked down at him. He doesn't want to be told he's got to give the girl back. Perhaps he can't see the connection. then he's the only one who can't. To the sound of drums and trumpets, Agamemnon entered and settled himself into his chair. Achilles was sitting directly opposite. When he stood, every eye in the arena was on him, though he addressed himself exclusively to Agamemnon. Well, Trojans on one side, plague on the other. We can't fight both, we may as well go home. That's true, isn't it? Agamemnon didn't reply. Or we can try to work out why all this is happening. There must be somebody, a seer, who can tell us what we've done to offend Apollo. Because clearly it's Apollo who sent the plague. He sat down. A confusion of movement in the front rank subsided to reveal the seer, Calchas, on his feet, looking nervous. Achilles half rose. Go ahead. Tell us. Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm alive. Calchas then prophesied at considerable length what everybody in the crowd already knew, that Apollo had sent the plague to punish Agamemnon for the insult to his priest, and that the only way now for Agamemnon to appease the god was to send the girl back to her father with the sacrifice of 100 bulls, and obviously without the ransom. Before Calchas finished speaking, Agamemnon's finger was jabbing at him. Pathetic, miserable little runt. When had he ever prophesied anything good? And it's true, he said. I don't want to lose her. I'll be honest. I prefer her to my wife. But of course, as commander-in-chief, I accept full responsibility. I don't want to see my own men dying. So yes, obviously yes, I'll send her back. When finally the cheering died down, Agamemnon said, But I'm afraid that leaves us with a bit of a problem. I have no prize. I want a replacement. Achilles stood up. Everything we got from Lyrnessus was shared out weeks ago. You'll just have to wait till we take Troy. No, Achilles. I'm not going to be left with nothing. And if you don't give me a prize, I'll take one. Perhaps your prize, Odysseus, or yours, he said. Or yours? All this was pretense. His eyes were already fixed on one man. Or yours, Achilles. For one insane moment, I thought there was a mistake. He couldn't mean me. In the arena, Achilles took several steps towards Agamemnon. I fought for that girl, he said. She's my prize, awarded by the army in recognition of my services. You have no right to take her. But it's always the same. I bear the brunt of the fighting, and you get the lion's share of everything we take. Agamemnon was shouting. I'll fetch the bloody girl myself, and then you'll all see what happens to a man who dares to pretend he's my equal. The army gave her to me, and the army's taking her away, because not one of you, Achilles looked round the semicircle of kings, not one of you has the courage to get up on your hind legs and tell him he's wrong. Well, all right then. He gets the girl, but don't expect me to go on fighting. Why should I risk my life or my men's lives for that pile of steaming dog shit over there? I dragged my way back to Achilles' compound. He wasn't going to fight for me. He'd made that perfectly clear. After a while, Iphis came in and held my hand. Neither of us spoke. At last, we heard footsteps in the hall. Achilles and Patroclus returning from their walk. I could see them both so clearly in my mind's eye, almost as if the wall between us had become transparent. Achilles, pacing up and down, Patroclus, outwardly calm, but with that muscle throbbing in his jaw. You might as well sit down, Patroclus said after a pause. They won't be here for hours yet. He's got to get Chryseis back to her father first, and find 100 bulls. I felt myself begin to hope the ship taking Chryseis home would have to stay overnight. The ritual slaughtering of 100 bulls would go on all night. Given all that time to reflect, wasn't it possible Agamemnon might change his mind? Was he really going to break up with Achilles and risk losing the war? For a girl? I wanted to say goodbye to Chryseis. It was beginning to get dark as I ran along the bay to where Agamemnon's ships were being made ready to set sail. It was Odysseus who led Chryseis up the gangplank onto the ship. We were jumping up and down, shouting, "Good luck! Have a safe journey!" With a barely perceptible movement of her fingers, she waved goodbye. Gazing around, I was filled with love for these women who'd come to see her off. They didn't begrudge her luck, though everyone would have given her right arm to be allowed to go home, and to have a home to go to. We watched the ship dwindle into the distance, and a disconsolate silence fell. I can't speak for the others, but I know at that moment I was as desolate as I'd ever been. When I got back to Achilles' hut, I went at once to the cupboard where I sat alone, waiting. I heard Patroclus announcing Lord Nestor. I thought this must be some kind of peace mission. Opened the door a crack so I could see at least a little of what was going on. Nestor raised his cup in a toast, then looked long and hard at Achilles. "I see you're not loading your ships yet. He hasn't come for the girl yet." Nestor smiled and shook his head. "You won't leave. Whatever else you are, you're not a deserter. I don't see it as desertion. This isn't my war. You were keen enough to get into it." I was 17. "You can't let other men do the fighting while you sit here and sulk." Achilles' reply was surprisingly measured. "I'm not going to risk my life or my men's lives for a weak, greedy, and cowardly king." "He may be all those things," said Nestor. "It doesn't matter. He has more men than you, more ships than you. That's why he's commander-in-chief, and you're not. None of that gives him the right to take another man's prize of honor. It doesn't belong to him. He hasn't earned it." There was a lot more, but I'd stopped listening. Honor, courage, loyalty, all those big words being bandied about. But for me there was only one word. It. It doesn't belong to him. He hasn't earned it. There came a sound in the hall. Alcimus burst into the room. "It's Agamemnon's heralds." The cup I was holding slipped from my fingers, splashing red wine down the skirt of my tunic. "Is Agamemnon with them?" Achilles asked. Alcimus shook his head. I saw Achilles glance sideways at Nestor, but when he spoke, it was to Patroclus. "See if Briseis is ready, will you?" The cupboard door opened wide. Patroclus came in and tried to put his arm round my shoulders, but I brushed him off. "Do you still think you can make him marry me?" He didn't have time to reply. Achilles called, "Patroclus, is she ready?" Patroclus offered me his hand. I took it because I knew I had to, and let myself be led into the other room. I risked a glance at Achilles, and to my amazement saw tears coursing down his cheeks. Achilles cried as I was taken away. I didn't. Now, years later, when none of it matters anymore, I'm still proud of that. But I cried that night.
Ever since he came to Troy, he's known that he won't be going home. That's the bargain. That's what the tricky gods have promised him. Everlasting glory in return for an early death under the walls of Troy. Memory plays strange tricks. One of his most vivid memories is of standing at the bedroom window and watching his mother wade into the sea, her long black hair fanning out like seaweed before the next wave swallowed her up. And yet he knows he can't possibly have seen that. The sea wasn't visible from the room he slept in as a child. No later imaginings, though, can distort his memory of the lonely bedroom, the ache of her absence. His father had tried everything. Priests, soothsayers, female relations, nurses. None of them knew what to do. The day Patroclus arrived, Achilles heard a commotion and, hoping it might be his mother, burst into the hall, only to skid to a halt when he saw his father talking to a stranger. Close by stood a big, ungainly boy with a bruised face and a broken nose. Another friend. The two boys stared at each other. What Achilles felt at that moment was not the familiar awkwardness of meeting yet another friend, but a long, cool shiver of recognition. But he'd been hurt too often to make friends easily, so when the other boy held out his hand, Achilles turned away. How did they come together? He can't remember, but then he remembers almost nothing about the 2 years after his mother left. He knows they fought, played, quarrelled, laughed, picked blackberries, came home with purple stains round their mouths, fell into bed and slept, as naked and sexless as 2 beans in a pod. Patroclus had saved his life long before they got anywhere near a battlefield. But then Achilles did the same for him, fighting beside him whenever one of the other boys attacked, until they stopped attacking and recognized a natural leader. By the time Achilles was 17, he and Patroclus were more than ready for war, ready to take on the whole world. The truth? Patroclus had taken his mother's place. He'll be back at the hut now, waiting for him. Patroclus has always hated these nocturnal visits of his to the sea. Perhaps he's afraid that one night Achilles might walk straight into it as his mother did. Well, worried or not, Patroclus is going to have to wait. He's not ready to face the empty bed, which needn't be empty, God knows. He's got plenty of girls. But that's not the problem. The problem is, he doesn't want the other girls. He wants that girl, and he can't have her. The fact is, he misses her. And why? Because her skin tastes of salt? Well, if that's all it takes, he can have the whole bloody lot of them thrown into the sea. Then they'll all come back smelling of salt. She's his prize. That's all. His prize of honour. No more, no less. It's nothing to do with the actual girl, and the pain he feels is merely the humiliation of having his prize stolen from him. That's what hurts, not the girl. The insult, the blow to his pride. Well, that's it. He's out of it now. Let them try to take Troy without him. They'll soon come crawling for help when they find out they can't.
So what did he do that was so terrible? Nothing much, I suppose. Nothing I hadn't been expecting. But when I thought it was over, and I was at last free to go, he took my chin between his thumb and forefinger and tilted my face up to his. For one insane moment, I actually thought he was going to kiss me. But then, inserting a finger between my teeth to prise my jaws apart, he worked up a big gob of phlegm, leisurely taking his time about it, and spat it into my open mouth. "There," he said. "Now you can go." Floundering around an unknown compound in the dark, I stumbled eventually on the women's huts. I was all the time frantically trying to scrub my mouth out with the hem of my tunic. I threw up on the sand. I was still wiping my mouth when a door opened and Ritsa's face peered out. She rocked me, murmuring reassurances, the sort of thing you say to children who've had a bad dream. It was a long time before I was calm enough to sleep. After the first night, he never wanted me again. But still, every evening I was required to pour wine for his guests. Men carve meaning into women's faces. Look at her, Achilles' prize. I took her away from him just as I can take your prize away from you. I can take everything you have. So I smiled and poured and smiled until my cheeks ached. The first few evenings after his quarrel with Achilles, Agamemnon was jubilant. There'd been no new cases of the plague since the return of Briseis to her father. Even more gratifying, Agamemnon's army had advanced several hundred yards across the muddy plain, so that treacherous little shit had already been proved wrong. Of course they could take Troy without him. But then gradually the mood began to darken. The ground they'd won was soon lost again, and the casualty figures were beginning to creep up. I was beginning to dread the nightly drinking parties. I sensed that my presence had begun to evoke a different response. I was no longer the visible sign of Agamemnon's power and Achilles' humiliation. No, I'd become the girl who'd caused the quarrel. Oh yes, I'd caused it, in much the same way, I suppose, as a bone is responsible for a dogfight. I remembered an incident I'd witnessed when I was a girl in Troy. A man had stepped forward and greeted Helen with every sign of respect, then bowing as he took his leave. Only I happened to turn round as we walked past, and I saw him spit on her shadow. I could feel the same hostility, the same contempt beginning to gather around me. I was Helen now.
One evening, Achilles and Patroclus went to see the fortifications Agamemnon had started building between the camp and the battlefield. A great trench had been dug in the scrubland that divided the sand dunes from the battlefield. The trench was filling with water as fast as the men could dig. A short distance away, another group of men was piling up sandbags to try to keep the water out. "Well," Achilles said, "he obviously thinks they're on the verge of breaking through." Patroclus turned to look back at the beach with its long row of ships pulled up onto the sand. A few blazing arrows shot onto the decks, and the entire fleet would be on fire in minutes. "You know, if they break through, you're going to have to fight anyway. They won't spare your ships just because you're not fighting." Achilles shrugged. "If I'm attacked, I'll fight. Come on, I've seen enough."
We knew the war was going badly for the Greeks. The battle was no longer a distant rumble, but a deafening roar. We waited in a tide race of hope and fear as day by day the Trojans advanced. One morning, I saw Reimagining approaching. I hadn't seen her for several days because she was working so hard she had to sleep in the hospital. She said, "I asked Machaon if I could have you to help, and he said yes." "He'll never let me go." "He will. Machaon's already asked." The main hospital was close to the arena. I followed Reimagining down the narrow space between two rows of beds to where Machaon was sitting on a bale of straw, stitching a wound. He glanced up. "Welcome on board." Reimagining took me to the back of the tent and sat me down at a long table. It felt good to be sitting beside her on the bench with a pestle and mortar in front of me and several jars of dried herbs close at hand. I remember the days I spent in that hospital, working alongside Reimagining as a happy time. Happy? Yes. The fact is I loved the work. I loved everything about it. I loved that pestle and mortar. I loved the smooth hollow of the cup. I loved the way the pestle fitted into the palm of my hand as if it had always been there. I lost myself in that work, and I found myself too. I was learning so much from Reimagining, but also from Machaon, who, once he saw I was interested and already had a little knowledge and skill, was generous with his time. I really started to think, I can do this. And that belief took me a step further away from being just Achilles' bedgirl or Agamemnon's spittoon. A day came when the battle got so loud, everybody in the hospital tent looked up, startled, thinking that at any moment the Trojans were going to burst in. There was an influx of wounded, followed almost immediately by another. All the talk was of defeat. They were angry with Achilles for refusing to fight, but they blamed Agamemnon for letting it happen. "He should give him the bloody girl back," one man said, as I helped him pour his wine. "It's all right for them," another man said. "How many generals do you see in here?" But that was about to change. First, Odysseus came in wounded, followed almost immediately by Ajax, and then by Agamemnon himself. He couldn't avoid the fighting now. Too much was at stake. Machaon himself dressed his wound, though it was hardly more than a scratch. The minute he swept out, the muttering started up again. From all ranks you heard the same thing. "Bribe him, plead with him, but for God's sake make the bugger fight." Over and over, as more wounded men crammed into the tent, you heard it. "Achilles! Achilles!" and again, "Achilles!" "No, no, and again, no," Agamemnon said. "I'm not going to crawl on my hands and knees to that bastard." A second later, Odysseus half fell into the room with a strip of bloody rag tied round one arm. "This had better not be bad news," Agamemnon said. Nestor turned and beckoned me. "Give him some wine." I poured a cup and took it to Odysseus, who tossed it back. "It is bad news, I'm afraid. They're camped just the other side of the trench. You can hear them talking. That's how close they are. 9 bloody years, and it ends like this?" Nestor straightened up. "It hasn't ended yet. Good as. Well, I'll fight tomorrow." "Nestor, with respect, you're too old." Nestor looked affronted. "We need every man we can get." "No, we need one man." "Save your breath," Agamemnon said. "Nestor said it all already." He sat down heavily. "So, let's get down to brass tacks. How much do you think it'll take?" Odysseus's mouth twisted. "He won't come cheap." Checking off the items on his fingers, Agamemnon began. 7 tripods, 10 bars of gold, 20 cauldrons, a dozen stallions, and the 7 women I got when we took Lesbos. Nestor had taken a seat by the fire. He lifted his head. "And the girl?" "Well, yes, obviously, the girl." They all turned to look at me, and I shrank back into the shadows. "If he still wants her," Odysseus said. He looked from one to the other. "Well, isn't she a bit shop-soiled?" "No more soiled than she was when she arrived," Agamemnon said. "I've never laid a finger on her." Nestor and Odysseus glanced across at me. I felt the blood rush to my face, but went on staring stubbornly at the floor. "And would you swear that under oath?" Nestor asked. His face was expressionless. "Of course." A log collapsed into the fire, sending a shower of sparks into the air. "Good," Nestor said. "And that's not all. No, not if. When we take Troy, he can choose whichever one of my daughters he wants. I'll make him my son-in-law, equal in every respect to my own son. In return, he has to acknowledge my authority as commander-in-chief. In the end, he has to obey me." "It is generous," Odysseus said carefully. "Will you go yourself?" "Course I bloody won't. I'm not going to plead with the little prick. I'll send... I don't know. You, I suppose." "He needs that wound seen to," Nestor said. "Nah, it's just a scratch. Course I'll go." "Who else?" Agamemnon said. You, Nestor? No, I don't think so. What about Ajax? Ajax? Odysseus said. He can barely string 3 words together. No, but Achilles respects him, as a fighter I mean, and they are cousins. Agamemnon looked from face to face. Is that settled then? The prospect of returning to Achilles' compound was miraculous. I don't think I'd ever known till then how much I missed the kindness of Patroclus. Oh, and the girl, Agamemnon said. Take her with you. Show him what he's been missing, and tell him I never, you know. Nestor turned to me. Go and get your cloak. Dismissed, I ran across to the women's huts where I found Briseis sitting on the floor. What's wrong? He's sending me back. They're trying to bribe Achilles, get him to start fighting again. I wrapped the mantle round me. Briseis shoved me towards the door. I heard Odysseus talking as I approached, laughing at the idea that Agamemnon hadn't laid a finger on me. It's not his finger I'm worried about, he sniggered. Then he caught sight of me and took something from inside his robe. Here, put this on. I saw he was holding a necklace of opals, 5 big stones, milky looking at first, but with a fire in their depths that stirred whenever his hand moved. My heart thumped. This was my mother's bride gift from my father. Agamemnon must have claimed it as his share of the plunder when Lyrnessus fell. When we reached Achilles' hut, Odysseus told me to wait outside. I sat there like a tethered goat, knowing my fate was being decided on the other side of that door.
Odysseus stepped into the firelight, closely followed by Ajax. "You're wounded," Achilles said. He reached out as if to remove the bandage, but Odysseus pulled away. "No, really, it's nothing." He draped his cloak across the injured arm. Patroclus finished handing round cups of wine. "Why don't you get to the point?" "I'm here on behalf of Agamemnon. I'm authorized to make you an offer in return for you leading your Myrmidons into battle tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning? Afternoon might be a bit late. Look, do you want to hear what he's offering or not?" Odysseus embarked on a long list of the objects Agamemnon was prepared to give. Tripods, textiles, gold, racehorses, women. When Odysseus finished speaking, Achilles seemed to be waiting for something else. "That's it. I think that's quite a lot. None of it's worth my life." Odysseus looked taken aback. "No, I know. But then, when have you ever fought for things? You fight for glory, for reputation." "Not anymore. This isn't my war. I don't want any part of it. What have the Trojans ever done against me? Have they stolen my cattle, burned my crops, taken my prize of honor? No. They've done nothing." Odysseus sat back, finding it hard to control his temper. "You agreed to be part of this coalition, and you can't back out now just because you've changed your mind. It's not honorable, Achilles." "I didn't back out because I changed my mind. I did it because his behavior was outrageous, and don't talk to me about honor when you come here representing a dog turd." In the silence that followed, Patroclus cleared his throat. "And Briseis?" "Ah." Odysseus staggered to the door and pushed it open against the wind. A few muffled words, and he was back, dragging behind him a woman. Dazed as a rabbit in a sudden glare, the girl stared from face to face. Achilles' knuckles whitened round his cup, but he said nothing. Odysseus looked baffled, obviously expecting a much more dramatic response. And he's prepared to swear a solemn oath in front of the entire army that he never touched her. Achilles got up and went across to Briseis. He put his forefinger under her chin and gently raised her head until she was forced to meet his eyes. A moment later, He turned to Odysseus. Tell him he can fuck her till her back breaks. What do I care? Briseis clapped her hand over her mouth. Immediately Patroclus was by her side, putting his arm round her shoulders and leading her out into the corridor and towards the hall. All right, Odysseus said, breathing deeply. Perhaps that wasn't such a good idea, but at least hear me out. You mean there's more? When we take Troy, when? 20 women, your choice. Well, obviously not Helen. 7 fortified cities, as much gold and bronze as your ships can carry, and Agamemnon's own daughter as your wife. He'll accept you as his son-in-law, equal in every respect to his own son. Equal in every respect to a 15-year-old boy who's never yet lifted a sword in anger. Achilles leant into Odysseus until their faces were only an inch apart. And I'm supposed to be flattered? Odysseus sat down and passed a hand across his eyes. What do you want, Achilles? Him. Here. I want an apology. I want him to admit he was wrong. And I'm supposed to go back and tell him that? Oh, I think we can do better than that. Tell him, if I was given the choice of either marrying his daughter or fucking a dead pig, I'd choose the pig every time. There, that should do it. Odysseus turned to Ajax. Come on, we're wasting our time.
I went on sitting at the table where Patroclus had placed me. It had all happened so quickly, hauled from darkness into light, stripped of my veil, and that one moment of disturbing intimacy when Achilles had looked straight into my eyes and suddenly there was nobody else in the room and I knew I couldn't lie. Patroclus poured 2 generous cups of wine. I'm sorry, he said. Odysseus shouldn't have brought you. No, I thought. If I hadn't given the game away, Achilles might have believed Agamemnon. It was a big thing to undertake, the swearing of a solemn oath in front of the gods. Odysseus, looking suddenly much older, came into the hall. I'll see you to the gate, Patroclus said. Back inside Agamemnon's compound, I'd have liked to slip into the women's huts, but I didn't dare. Does he actually understand what I'm offering? Agamemnon said. Yes, Odysseus said wearily. Did he favour you with a reason? This isn't his war. He's got nothing against the Trojans. They've never raided his cattle. They've never burned his crops. They've never stolen his wife. And he doesn't care how many Greeks die, Nestor asked. No. He's not human, Ajax blurted out. Well, of course he bloody isn't, Agamemnon said. His mother's a fish. Nestor smiled thinly. A sea goddess, I believe. A long silence. There's always the Myrmidons, Nestor said. They don't like what's happening. Agamemnon looked thoughtful. Would they follow Patroclus? They would, Nestor said. They respect him. I'm inclined to agree, Odysseus said. It's worth a try. I suppose so, Agamemnon said grudgingly. Nestor, why don't you sound him out? As Agamemnon's guests lingered over their good nights, I began to edge closer to the door. But just as the door closed behind Odysseus, Agamemnon said, No, you stay. Carefully wiping all expression from my face, I turned back into the room.
Patroclus was trying and failing to disguise his anger. Well, he said at last, that was brutal. The dead pig bit? Don't worry, he won't repeat it. No, Achilles. Briseis, that was brutal. Achilles shifted in his chair. Well, at least she didn't lie. She didn't speak. Patroclus pushed the dogs away from him. I think I'll turn in. You never know. We might be fighting tomorrow. No, we will not be fighting tomorrow. We will if your ships are on fire. Next morning, The Myrmidons crowded together in the sterns of the ships, cheering on the Greek fighters, for all the world like spectators at a chariot race. Sickened, Patroclus turned away. Since when had war been a game for fit young men to stand and watch? He went inside the hut, where he lay down on Achilles' bed. "Patroclus!" Groggy from his abrupt awakening, Patroclus swung his legs over the side of the bed. Achilles yelled again. "What do you want?" "I think Machaon's wounded. I saw him just now in Nestor's chariot. At least, I think it was him. Would you mind going to ask?" He set off at a run till he reached Nestor's hut. At the far end, lying on a couch, was Machaon. He had no business on a battlefield, and yet he'd turned out to fight. Patroclus fell on his knees beside him. "How are you?" Machaon winced. "Looks worse than it is." Patroclus went through into the living quarters, where he found Nestor, surrounded by pieces of armour he'd unbuckled and let drop. God, how old was he? 70? "Patroclus, I can't stay. Achilles sent me to ask after Machaon, but I can see he's being well looked after." "So, Achilles cares about Machaon?" "Well, yes, of course." "One man?" "Do you know how many men died today while he stood on his ship and watched?" "I think I should be going." "No, please. I'm an old man. Humour me." Reluctantly, Patroclus sat down. "You could do it, you know." "Do what?" "Lead the Myrmidons." "You mean without Achilles?" "Yes. Why not?" Patroclus shook his head. "You'd never agree." "How do you know?" "I think he's looking for a way out. You might just be doing him a favour." "I don't know what to say." "You know they've already set fire to one of Agamemnon's ships." "No, I didn't know." Nestor held up his thumb and forefinger so close they were almost touching. "They're that close." A long silence. Only Nestor's arthritic fingers twisting together betrayed the tension. Finally, Patroclus said, "All right, you win. I'll suggest it. I can't promise more than that." Nestor accompanied him to the door. "Just one more thing," he said. "Ask him to lend you his armour." "What? Now I know you're mad." "If they see him on the battlefield, or think they see him, it's worth 1,000 men." Nestor stood back, watching the possibilities work like maggots under the young man's skin. He'd said enough. "Well, do your best." On his way back to Achilles' compound, Patroclus heard his name called and looked up to see an old friend, Eurypylus, limping along the path towards him with an arrowhead embedded in his thigh. "Come on, let's get you seen to." Patroclus draped Eurypylus' arm across his shoulders. When they reached the hospital tents, he found Eurypylus a space right up against the canvas and lowered him carefully onto a blanket. He looked around. A dozen or so women were sitting at a long table, some grinding herbs. He needed to clean and bandage the wound, pour a pain-killing draught into Eurypylus' mouth, and then get back to Achilles. He selected several bunches of dried herbs and sat down to begin grinding. Intent on finishing quickly, he didn't immediately recognize the girl sitting opposite him, but then he glanced across the table, and there she was, Briseis. "What on earth are you doing here?" "I work here." As she lifted her head, he saw she had a split lip. Her face and neck were covered in bruises. None of this had been there the previous night when Odysseus had pulled off her veil. "How are you?" "All right. Surviving." After that, they worked in silence. He found Eurypylus and started dribbling the painkiller into his mouth. Briseis began washing the leg, gentle, thorough sweeping movements. Eurypylus gulped down the remainder of the draught. Patroclus lowered his head gently onto the blanket. A few seconds later, he was asleep. She walked with him to the entrance. He reached out and gently touched her face. "What's all this about?" Apparently I didn't try hard enough to make Achilles want me back. And it's true. I didn't. I should have lied. And so they parted. 100 yards further on, he turned to look back and saw her standing at the entrance to the tent, one hand raised, watching him go. Achilles was silent, thinking hard. "If I wore your armour, they'd think it was you. The Trojans, I mean." Patroclus waited. "It would fit me. Just about." A measuring look. "It might be enough to push them back." "Yes, at the expense of making you a target, and not just anybody's, the best, Hector." "You're saying I'm rubbish?" "No, you're not rubbish, but you're not me either." A deflating silence. "I don't care what happens to me." "No, but I do." Achilles walked the length of the room and back again, coming to a halt in front of Patroclus. "I suppose it might work." "I know it would. Once they see the armour, they won't be able to see past it." "All right, but with conditions. 1, the minute they fall back from the ships, you stop. I don't care how well it's going, you stop. And 2, you don't fight Hector." "All right," agreed. Patroclus stood up and took a deep breath.
It was all over the camp that Achilles had relented, that he was going to fight at last. I didn't believe it. Unable to stay away, I walked through the gates of Achilles' compound with a veil wound tight round my head and shoulders. When Achilles himself came out and climbed into the stern of his ship to speak, there was a full-throated roar of approval, though it must have seemed strange to the men to see him standing there, unarmed and alone. As Achilles finished speaking, the door of the hut was thrown open, and Achilles came out. Dead silence. I don't think the men were surprised. They knew what was happening. But that moment, when the two versions of Achilles met and stood face to face, was chilling. That quite specific dread people feel in the presence of the uncanny. The Myrmidons were to lead the attack, because they were fresh, and because everybody knew the sight of Achilles would strike terror into the Trojan ranks. I could imagine the consternation, the alarm as Priam on the battlements and Hector in the field recognized the shining helmet with its dancing horsehair plumes. Hector wouldn't hold back. He'd be carving his way towards that helmet. But it wasn't Achilles inside the armour. It was Patroclus. That morning, I found out what it was like to have divided loyalties. I didn't dare pray, because I didn't know what to pray for. I slipped down onto the beach and started wandering along the shore. I didn't know where I was going until I felt a sudden chill and looked up to see the first of the black ships towering over me. Wanting to get away from it, I started to walk faster, and then just as I reached the stern, there he was, coming full pelt round the corner. We almost collided. "You," he said, "what on earth are you doing here?" I tried to edge past him, but he caught my arm, his nails digging deep into my skin. "I wish I'd never met you," said very quietly. "I wish you died that day at Lyrnessus." He rammed me hard against the side of the ship. I raised my arms to shield my face. But he just seized the end of a rope ladder, and with a few powerful steps climbed onto the deck. I waited till I was sure he was gone, then ran.
Putting his encounter with the girl behind him, Achilles concentrates his whole attention on the battlefield. Patroclus is carving his way through the Trojan ranks towards Troy and the inevitable meeting with Hector. What's he doing? The ships have been safe for the last hour at least. Turn back. Don't fight Hector. Hector's mine. Could he have made it any clearer? Back in his hut, he curls up on the bed, where the sheets still hold the smell of Patroclus' skin, and says his name over and over again, as if just saying it might be a charm against disaster. Patroclus. And again louder. Patroclus. On the battlefield, Patroclus hears Achilles calling his name, and for a second his concentration falters. Long enough, because suddenly there's Hector straight in front of him. He tries to raise Achilles' sword, but Hector drives the spear hard into his side, and he's on the ground, thrashing like a fish in a pool that's drying out. "Achilles!" he shouts. And again, as the red blood spurts out of him and his spirit begins to slip away into the dark. "Achilles!" A mile away, Achilles lifts his head. Just for a moment there he thought he'd heard Patroclus calling his name. Back onto the ship, see what's happening. Halfway up the rope ladder, he stops, because something's caught his eye. A movement. A chariot being driven hard and fast. Somehow he has to stop that chariot getting here, because when it does, he's going to hear the worst words he's ever heard. He lets himself drop to the ground and walks into the centre of the yard to wait for what he knows is coming. Nothing moves in the huts around him. White sun, black shadows, knife-edged. Silence.
I wasn't there when Achilles got the news, but Iphis watching from the doorway of one of the women's huts saw and heard it all. Achilles let out a great cry and fell to the ground, his hands clawing at the filthy sand, scooping it up and throwing it over his face and hair. Suddenly, a high wind started blowing, and then they saw her, striding up the beach, silver-grey stormlight casting a metallic gleam over her face and hair. Thetis. A silence fell as she approached. Those who were still out in the open covered their eyes or turned away, leaving the goddess alone with her son.
What's wrong? The fishy smell of her fingertips as she cradles his head in her hands, and so it floods out of him. The death of Patroclus, his guilt, because none of this should have happened. It should have been him inside that armour. But enough of that. Now all that matters is finding and killing Hector. But if you kill Hector, your own death follows at once. Do you think I care? It's the only thing keeping me alive, the thought of killing him. You can't fight without armour. Why not, if I'm going to die anyway? But she's right, of course. Without armour, he won't live long enough to reach Hector. Stay away from the battlefield for now. Tomorrow at dawn, I'll bring you armour fit for a god. And so she walks back into the sea, sinking beneath a swelling wave. On the battlefield, the Greeks pull Patroclus' body clear and carry it back to their camp. He takes Patroclus in his arms and rocks him, feeling the last warmth deep in his chest and belly, though his arms and legs are already cold. Before dawn, he's up and waiting on the beach. There she is, striding out of the sea, carrying his new and glittering armour. He needs this armour to get onto the battlefield, that's all. She embraces him. He can't wait to be shot of her. War. Hector. That's all he cares about. He won't rest now, till Hector's dead.
I heard him before I saw him, his battle cry ringing around the camp as he strode along the beach, summoning the men to war. Soon, the entire camp was converging on the arena. Last of all came Agamemnon, his wounded arm held stiffly by his side. As he entered, silence fell. One of his heralds had grabbed me by the arm and bundled me to the front. Agamemnon was trying to assemble the goods he'd promised Achilles. That promise still had to be kept. Achilles stood at the centre of the ring. He felt nothing but shame, he said, that he and his dear comrade Agamemnon had quarrelled over a girl. Better the girl had died when he took her city. How much grief and suffering the Greeks would have been spared. How many brave men now dead would still be alive. He was blaming me for Patroclus. That's when I knew there was no hope. But enough of that, Achilles went on. That's past. He was ready now to fight, and this time there'd be no stopping till he brought Hector's head back to the camp on the point of his spear. Meanwhile, the bales of rich embroidered cloth, the gold dishes and plates were carried from Agamemnon's storage huts and loaded onto carts. I brought up the rear along with the 7 girls from Lesbos and all the other things. The first thing I saw when I returned to Achilles' compound was Patroclus' body laid out on a bier. I fell on my knees and clasped his cold feet in my hands. I wept without restraint, and I knew I'd lost one of the dearest friends I ever had. I'd noticed a certain uneasiness among the men. Patroclus should have been cremated by now, but for some reason Achilles had decided the funeral rites must wait. Perhaps he was hoping that after he killed Hector, his own death would follow so fast he could be burned with Patroclus on a single fire. He'd have liked that. Before dawn the next day he was up and armed. Then, yelling his great battle cry, Achilles raised his spear and signalled the advance. And so began the greatest killing spree of the war. 5 days it lasted, and during all that time he scarcely slept. The Trojans were fighting now right under the walls of Troy. As soon as the Myrmidons marched off to the battlefield, I'd climb into the stern of Achilles' ship and watch. I was there when on the morning of the 5th day the Trojan line finally broke. Hector walked out to face Achilles alone. I couldn't bear to go on watching. I went back to the hut and told the other women what I'd seen. Above the relentless rattle of the shuttles, we heard a new sound. One by one, the looms stopped, and in the silence we heard the cry of lamentation more clearly than before. And we knew that Hector, the last and greatest defender of Troy, was dead. Not only had Achilles killed Hector, he'd driven his corpse 3 times round the walls of Troy, while Priam, Hector's father, stood on the battlements, watching his son reduced to a bag of leaking guts. That was the moment the Greeks won the war, and everybody knew it. Achilles placed his hands, red with Hector's blood, side by side on Patroclus' chest. "Hector's dead," he told him. "Everything I promised you, I've done. You can sleep now." It was a solemn moment after the tumult of battle. But if Achilles was content to mark the moment of his greatest triumph with a renewed outpouring of grief, Agamemnon was definitely not. Not only did he announce a great feast in Achilles' honour, but he actually came in person to escort Achilles to his compound. Achilles did his best to laugh with the rest of them, but he seemed dazed. He looked hollow, I thought. All that killing, all that revenge. After Achilles departed with the other kings, the Myrmidons settled down to their own celebration. I couldn't sleep. Partly, I suppose, it was the noise, but also the thought of Hector lying out there on the muddy ground, mutilated and alone. After a while I got up, selected a sheet of pure white linen, pulled my mantle close round my face, and crept out to the stables. The corpse was lying in the middle of the yard, so badly broken it hardly retained the shape of a man. I spread the linen sheet gently over his poor ruined face and tiptoed away, leaving him alone under the indifferent stars.
The feast seems to go on forever, but then, abruptly, he stands up. "Need a piss," he says. Outside, he leans on the wall of a stable block. He knows he doesn't want to go back in, so he sets off to walk back to his own compound along the beach. Hector's dead. That's the main thing. The decisive blow in the entire war has been struck by him. Killing Hector isn't enough. He knew that the minute he did it. What he really wanted to do was eat him. It's the truth. He'd wanted to rip Hector's throat out with his teeth. Sleep. He sits down, lies back, wiggling his shoulder blades to make hollows in the sand, and abruptly falls into a sleep that's as sparse and threadbare as the night. A few minutes later, he's awake again. Or is he? He can see the slopes of shingle and the clumps of marram grass, but the dream hasn't stopped. Patroclus is bending over him, vigorous as he'd been in life. "You're neglecting me, Achilles." "No," he tries to say, but can't. Can't speak, can't move either. "You haven't even buried me. Do you know what it feels like to have flies laying eggs in your skin?" Patroclus looks so real. "Burn me, Achilles. Give my body to the fire. Bury my bones in the golden urn your mother gave you. It's big enough for two. Let's lie together in death as we did in life." He wants Patroclus in his arms right now. Suddenly, the bonds that have kept him paralyzed drop away. With a cry, he reaches out, but Patroclus' spirit slips between his fingers and vanishes. To the end of his life, he'll believe Patroclus came back and spoke to him. And yet, if Patroclus is alive, and he's just seen him, heard him speak, is Hector really dead? That's what he needs to do now. See Hector, piss on whatever's left of him, and then give Patroclus funeral games fit for a king. Slowly, he walks back to the camp. He slips silently between the huts, making for the stable yard. Once there, he stops. Somebody's thrown a sheet over Hector's body. He can't believe any of his men would do that, and yet who else? A slave wouldn't dare. What he left here was a bag of broken bones, but the body under the white sheet has the length and shape of a man. Slowly, very slowly, he's ashamed of how much courage it takes. He bends down and pulls the sheet away. Hector's face, flawless, gazes up at him. No human being could have done this. It has to be the work of the gods. Well then, fuck the gods. He throws back his head and yells his defiance. As soon as the sun's up, he'll tie Hector's body even more tightly to his chariot and drive full tilt round the camp, and this time he won't stop till every bone's broken, every feature's smashed. Nobody's going to cheat him out of his revenge, not even a god.
Achilles kept his word. Everything he'd promised Patroclus he did. He cut the throats of 12 Trojan youths, killed Patroclus's horses too, and threw them on the fire, followed by his favourite dogs. From the doorways of the women's huts, we saw flames and sparks leaping high into the night sky. During the funeral games, Achilles was everywhere, judging races, awarding prizes. Nothing was too much for him to give in memory of Patroclus. Armour, horses, dogs, women, Iphis. He made her first prize in the chariot race. We had no warning. When Automedon came to fetch her, we were sitting mending clothes. She tried to hold on to me, but Automedon dragged her out into the yard. One last agonized glance, and she was gone. I suppose it must have been 4 or 5 nights after the funeral games were over, just as I'd finished serving the first round of drinks. Automedon beckoned me across to him and said, "Achilles wants you tonight." My legs turned to sand. I went on pouring wine till the meal was over and then slipped out of the hall. I combed my hair, pinched my cheeks, and went to sit in the cupboard. Finally, heavy footsteps approached the door. Achilles pushed it open and jerked his head towards the other room. I followed him in, taking a seat as far away from him as I could get. Patroclus's empty chair dominated the room. The lyre lay on the table, but he didn't pick it up. The silence was choking me. When I could bear it no longer, I said, "Why don't you play?" "Can't. Won't work." In bed, in the dark, I was the liar. He fumbled about, as if trying to remember what it was that had once excited him. When it became clear nothing was going to happen, he groaned and rolled over onto his back. He was so quiet he might have been asleep, but I could tell from his breathing he wasn't. I said, "Would you like me to go?" In reply, he turned on his side away from me. I slipped out of bed and groped about for my clothes. Returning to the women's huts as early as this would let everybody know I'd fallen from favour. The slave market had just moved a step closer.
He's done everything he promised. He's buried his friend's charred bones in a golden urn, big enough to hold his bones too when the time comes, which, please God, will not be long. Now he's beginning to understand that grief doesn't strike bargains. There's no way of avoiding the agony, or even getting through it faster. It's got him in its claws, and it won't let go till he's learnt every lesson it has to teach. Giving up any idea of sleep, he pulls on his tunic and leaves the hut. Last night, he dumped a torn and bloody mess of broken bones into the filth of the stable-yard. This morning, yet again, Hector looks like he's asleep. The sleep that every night eludes Achilles. He'd like to throw back his head and howl. Instead, he climbs into the chariot and begins to turn the horses round. Behind him, Hector's body bumps over the rutted ground. By the time he returns, Hector's body has been reduced to a mass of red pulp and splintered bone. Achilles throws his reins at a tight-lipped groom and strides down the passage that leads to his hut. Once inside his living quarters, he returns to the mirror. He knows what he's going to see, but he needs to make himself see it to prove he's not afraid. Reflected back from the shining metal, the injuries he's just inflicted on Hector lie like shadows on his own skin. Is this why they won't look at him, the grooms who run to take his reins? Standing on the veranda steps, he looks around him at the waking camp. The preparations for his dinner are already underway. Looms are clattering, making clothes for his back and covers for his bed. He's in control of everything he sees. But every morning, he's compelled to drive his chariot round and round Patroclus's grave, to defile Hector's body, and in the process, as he understands perfectly well, to dishonour himself. And he has no idea how to make any of it stop.
After that disastrous night, I didn't expect Achilles to send for me again, but he did. Only 2 nights later, in fact. Dreading the night, I sat on the bed and waited. But when, eventually, he stood up, it wasn't to get undressed, but to fetch a pair of scissors. He handed me the scissors and held up the hacked-off ends of his hair. "Here," he said, "see what you can do with that." This was unexpected. I took the scissors and started to cut. A strange feeling touching him like that, in a way more intimate than sex. I didn't like it, but after the first few fumbles I was making a pretty good job of his hair. It helped that the scissors were sharp, very sharp. I ran my fingers through his hair to check that the ends were even, and suddenly, no warning, saw him lying on the floor in a pool of blood with the scissors sticking out of his neck. The vision, if that's what it was, brought me to a halt. I just stood there, feeling slightly sick. When I raised my head, I saw him watching me. "Go on," he said. "Why don't you?" We stared at each other's reflections in the mirror. I wanted to say, "Because your precious myrmidons would torture me to death if I did." But I knew it would be dangerous to say anything, so I just lowered my head and went on cutting, and this time I was careful not to stop until I'd finished.
Torches gutter, and there, suddenly, is an old man, white-haired but not stooped, leaning on a staff, walking towards him. Father, he thinks. Though, as the old man comes closer, it's obvious he's nothing like Peleus. Nobody else seems to have noticed him. The man reaches him and then lowers himself to the floor and clasps Achilles' knees, the position of a supplicant. Achilles. Just the name, no title. Despite this abject kneeling at his feet, there's an assumption of equality here. Priam. He whispers the name, so the men around him won't hear. Instant rage. How the hell did you get in? By now, his closest aides are on their feet. They still don't know who this is, but they know he should never have been able to get into the compound, let alone walk straight into the hall and reach Achilles unchallenged. Achilles holds up his hand, and grumbling like circling dogs, they fall back. Priam's weeping now. I asked you a question. How did you get in? I don't know. Guided, I suppose. By a god? I believe so. Really? You didn't bribe the guards? No, nothing like that. I heard what you said when I came in. You said, Father. He certainly thought father, but he's certain he didn't say it aloud. He'll be an old man now, your father. He can't be a lot younger than me, though at least he's got the consolation of knowing you're still alive. My son's dead. Achilles twists in his chair. What do you want? I want to take Hector's body home. The words drop like stones. I've brought a ransom. It's outside in the cart. Give me my son, Achilles. Think of your father, who's an old man like me. Honour the gods. Priam grips his knees harder. I do what no man before me has ever done. I kiss the hands of the man who killed my son." Achilles feels the thin, dry lips brush the back of his hand, and the sensation provokes an immediate burst of rage. He pushes Priam away, but gently. Then he covers his face and weeps for his father and for Patroclus, for the living and the dead. And Priam weeps for Hector and for all his other sons who've died in this interminable war. They're so close, they're almost touching, but their griefs are parallel, not shared. By now, it's obvious to everybody who the old man is. Silence. Achilles holds out his hand and raises Priam gently to his feet. "You can have your son tomorrow, though not now. Come, let's go through there and have a drink. When did you last eat?" Alcimus and Automedon are still hovering. "You can go now," Achilles says. "I'll be all right."
Usually, when entertaining a king, Achilles would have worn one of his richest robes, but tonight he changed into the coarsest and plainest tunic he possessed, obviously not wanting to outshine his guest. Nothing would have pleased me more than to be able to think of Achilles as a thug, with no redeeming characteristics or grace of manner. But he was never that. I set another jug of wine on the table by his elbow and withdrew into the shadows. First problem. Priam had no knife. Quickly remedied, Achilles simply polished his own dagger on a linen cloth and handed it across the table, while I scurried around to find him a replacement. Oh, it sounds trivial, I know, but that trifling little incident changed everything. Achilles' face had gone smooth with shock. He'd known Priam was unarmed, no sword, no posse of Trojan fighters waiting outside the door. But to come into the hall of his worst enemy without even a dagger. Nobody left home without a knife, not even a slave. This was a kind of courage he'd never encountered before. I knew he'd be wondering, could I do that? Could I do what Priam's just done? After the meal, the atmosphere was tense again. "Please," Priam said, "I want to see Hector now." I could see Achilles thinking of Hector's body lying on the cobbles of the stable yard, naked. "Of course you can. Tomorrow. First thing. I promise." He told me to make a bed up for Priam on the veranda, but round the side where it couldn't be seen from the main entrance, and to make it as comfortable as possible. "Take the furs from my bed if you like. I don't want him to be cold." When I returned to the living quarters, I found Priam dozing over his wine. He bade Achilles a courteous good night, and I guided him to the bed. "Don't I know you?" "We have met, sir, a long time ago." "Where?" "In Troy. I lived there for 2 years. Helen used to bring me with her to the battlements." "Yes, I knew I'd seen you before. You're Helen's little friend." When I went back inside, Achilles was standing by the table. "Come on, we've got to get the body washed. He's got to be out of here before dawn. If they find him here, they'll kill him." Taking a torch, Achilles led the way to the stables, Automedon and Alcimus following behind. I could see Hector's body, spread eagled on the filthy ground, but still the length and shape of a man. I shivered with relief, because it had crossed my mind that the gods might play one final trick, and Achilles would find what he should have been finding for the last week at least, a pile of partially articulated bones. They lifted Hector until he was shoulder height, I held the torch high as the men shuffled slowly down the narrow passage that led to the laundry hut, where the dead were prepared for cremation. Achilles ordered Automedon and Alcimus out of the room. I'd been assuming all three of them would go and leave me to it. Instead, there was Achilles, facing me across the slab. I filled 2 buckets with water and handed him a cloth. With every sweep of our hands, bands of white flesh became visible, almost as if we were bringing Hector to life, creating him. We dressed him, then wrapped him in a sheet of fine linen. Achilles insisted on carrying Hector to the cart himself. "I think we need a drink," Achilles said. So the 3 of us followed him to his living quarters. After they'd finished the wine, Achilles rose and wished them good night. I started to get undressed, since I was evidently staying. I was praying he'd fall asleep quickly, but he was as full of energy as I'd ever known him. Something else, too. There were times he seemed almost tentative, not unsure of himself, but more as if he were wanting a response. When, at last, I was sure Achilles was asleep, cautiously I moved my thigh and my skin unpeeled from his. I reached for my mantle and slipped out. Priam was asleep. I knew I couldn't just shake him awake, so I fetched a bowl of warm water for him to wash. As I approached the bed, his lids suddenly flashed open. "Lord Priam," I said gently, "I've brought you some water to get washed." "Well, my dear, that's very kind." He rolled over onto his elbow. "Take me with you," I said. "My sister's in Troy. You remember her. She's married to Leander, and she's the only family I've got left." He put his hand on my shoulder. "My dear, you're not thinking straight. Yes, your sister will give you a home, but a few weeks of freedom, and then Troy falls and you're a slave again. No, I'm sorry." He shook his head. "I can't do it." I heard a movement behind me and turned to see Achilles standing in the shadows. How long had he been there? "I see Briseis is looking after you." "Long enough." "Yes, she's been very kind." "It's time to go," Achilles said. "It'll be light soon, and we daren't risk Agamemnon finding you here." By the time we reached the stable yard, Automedon and Alcimus were already harnessing the mules to the cart. At a gesture from Achilles, I lifted the linen cloth so Priam could see his son's face. Priam made a little noise deep in his throat, then reached out and touched his son's hair. He was crying now. At last he turned to Achilles. "How long do you need to bury him?" Achilles asked. I saw that by focusing on the practicalities, Achilles had averted what might easily have become a confrontation. Grief was what united them, but it divided them as well. "Oh, we'll need a ceasefire. I'll make sure you get it. Then 11 days for the funeral games, and on the 12th day we'll fight again. If fight we must." "I'll see you to the gate," Achilles said. "But first, let's drink the parting cup." I thought Priam might refuse, but he consented. He even took Achilles' arm as they walked back to the hut. Automedon and Alcimus followed. As soon as I was sure I wasn't being observed, I climbed into the cart and lay down beside Hector. I pulled the linen sheet loose so its folds would cover me too. I tensed as I heard their footsteps returning. Then I felt the cart tilt as Priam climbed into the driving seat and we lurched forward. Hector's cold flesh rubbing against my cheek, every muscle clenched in fear. But my mind was racing. I saw my sister, My brother-in-law, the warmth and safety of their home, and the great prize of freedom. Me, myself again. A woman, not a thing. But the more I thought about it, the more insane this bid for freedom seemed. Even if I succeeded, what did the future hold? A few weeks of happiness, shadowed by fear, and then I'd be hiding in another citadel, waiting for Agamemnon to unleash thousands of drunken fighters onto the streets. Priam's right, I thought. This is mad. At last, the lurching stopped. At any moment, the cart would move forward again. It had to be now. I freed myself from the sheet, wriggled to the end of the cart, and slid down to the ground. Achilles glanced up as I came in. I thought he looked surprised. I prepared bread and olives and cheese. He seemed to be hungry, tearing off pieces of bread. Then he said casually, only it wasn't casual, "Why did you come back?" So he'd known all along. For a moment, the shock made my mind go blank, but then I thought, if you knew I was in the cart, why didn't you stop me? I don't know. He pushed the platter towards me. It wasn't exactly a gracious invitation. He simply pointed at my chest and then at a chair. So I sat down, facing him, and we ate and drank together. I'd said, I don't know, because I couldn't think of anything else to say. All that stuff about Troy falling and becoming a slave again, it was all true. But I'd known all that before I got into the cart. Something I couldn't put my finger on had made me turn back. Perhaps no more than a feeling that this was my place now. After 9 long years of blood and conflict, these 11 shining days of peace, I remember it as a strange time. On the second day, Ajax came to dinner, bringing with him Tecmessa and their little son. I sat watching Achilles and Ajax play dice. Suddenly, Ajax leapt to his feet. I turned to follow his gaze, but there was nobody there, and when I looked back, Ajax was on the ground. He lay there, knees drawn up to his chin, wailing. Achilles let the outburst run its course until, at last, Ajax regained control of himself. Neither of them spoke. Tecmessa, who'd started to stand up, settled again into her chair. "He's not sleeping," she said. "He has these awful nightmares. The other night he woke up screaming. If I try to talk about it, it's silence becomes a woman." Every woman I've ever known was brought up on that saying. We sat and contemplated it for a moment, and then suddenly burst out laughing. I'd never liked Tecmessa all that much, but after that moment of shared laughter, we were friends. I said, "How soon can you tell if you're pregnant?" She stared at me. "Depends. I knew straight away. Sick as a dog from day one. But, you know, everybody's different." "Is it his?" "Yes. Not Agamemnon's." "Not possible. The back gate, remember?" She was overjoyed for me. A good deal more overjoyed than I was for myself.
His grief for Patroclus grows easier with the approach of his own death. Achilles lives in the present. He rarely, if ever, thinks about the future, because there is no future. It's amazing how easily he's come to accept that. And then one morning, He finds Briseis outside, bent double, retching into the sand. "What's the matter?" "Nothing." "Well, something is." "I'm pregnant." It takes a moment to sink in. He says, "Are you sure?" She looks him steadily in the eye. "Yes." She's not a woman who tells lies. The idea of this new life worms itself into his mind, and with that comes a renewed fear of dying. One evening, towards the end of the 11-day truce, Briseis is watching him from the bed. It's late. "I've just remembered there's something I've got to do," he says, and goes out into the hall. He yells for Alcimus, who comes running. He pours the lad a drink, sits him down, and tries to explain. "If I die," Achilles says. Alcimus looks terrified. "Look, I just want to make a few sensible plans for the future." Alcimus gapes at him. Briseis is pregnant. That went in. "If I die, I want you to marry her, and," he holds up his hand, "I want you to take her to my father. I want the child to grow up in my father's house." Silence. "Is that all right?" Alcimus says miserably, "It's an honor I don't deserve." "But you'll do it." "Yes." "Swear." "Yes, of course. I swear."
On the morning of the day he went back to war, Achilles stood on the veranda and yelled for Alcimus. I was still in bed. I didn't think whatever Achilles wanted Alcimus for could possibly involve me. The door opened, and a priest walked in. There can hardly have been a scruffier or more badly dressed bride. When the brief ceremony was over, Alcimus backed out of the room, leaving me alone with Achilles, who said brusquely, "It's for the best. He's a good man." And then, perhaps noticing how shocked I was, he relented a little, taking my chin between his thumb and forefinger and tilting my head. "He'll be kind to you, and he'll take care of the child." Achilles would not have approved of the manner of his death. An arrow between the shoulder blades shot by Paris, Helen's husband, in revenge for the death of Hector. There's an even nastier version of the story, that the arrow was poisoned. Others say Paris shot him in the heel, the only part of his body that was vulnerable to wounds. Either way, a coward's weapon in a coward's hands. That's the way Achilles would have seen it. Achilles' heel. Of all the legends that grew up around him, that was by far the silliest. His mother, in a desperate attempt to make him immortal, is supposed to have dipped him in the waters of Lethe, but she held him by the heel, making that the only part of his body that was not invulnerable to mortal wounds. Invulnerable to wounds? His whole body was a mass of scars. Believe me, I know. On the night they finally set fire to Troy, Agamemnon gave a feast. At the feast he got so drunk he fell over twice. Alcimus heard him rambling to Odysseus. "Achilles," he kept saying. "Achilles!" He was leaning in towards Odysseus. Look at the trouble Achilles caused over that girl. One girl, and he wouldn't go on fighting because he couldn't have her. "Bloody near lost us the war." Odysseus waved his hand dismissively. "Well, he can't lose you the war now, can he? You've won." "No, but he could stop us getting home." "I really don't see how. All we need's a change of wind. Then it's 3 days, that's all." But gradually, as the evening wore on, Agamemnon's jitters hardened into certainty. Achilles had to have a girl, and not just any girl, the absolute best. The pick of the crop. And so Polyxena, Priam's virgin daughter, 15 years old, was selected for sacrifice. Hecamede and I threaded our way through the crowd. We found Hecuba, with Polyxena kneeling at her feet. She was actually trying to console her mother, begging her not to grieve. It was past noon when the men came. Polyxena was calm as she embraced her mother and sisters. Hecamede and I took our places by her side and, preceded by the guards, shuffled to the door. I remember black shadows on trampled soil, the searing white heat of the sun. And then Polyxena began to speak. Perhaps they thought she was going to curse them, and the curse of a person about to die is always powerful, because she'd got no further than Agamemnon's name when a guard forced a strip of cloth between her teeth and knotted it tightly at the back of her head. One quick, clean cut. I honestly believe she was dead before she hit the ground. No further ceremony. The women were herded roughly into the arena and lined up for the march to the ships. I started walking the other way, determined to take one last look at the burial mound, but one of the guards raised his spear. "Oi," somebody said. "What do you think you're doing? That's Alcimus's wife." And immediately the spear was lowered. There was one thing more I knew I had to do. Polyxena's corpse lay where it had fallen. Bracing myself, I rolled her over onto her back. The deep gash in her throat made her look as if she had two mouths, both silent. Silence becomes a woman. Slowly, I worked the gag loose and took it out of her mouth. I looked at the burial mound and tried to say goodbye to Patroclus, who'd always been kind, and to Achilles. I didn't grieve for Achilles then, and I don't now, but I do very often think of him. How could I not? He's the father of my first child. But it's the girls I remember most. Ariana, holding her hand out to me on the roof of the citadel before she turned and plunged to her death. Or Polyxena saying, "Better to die on Achilles' burial mound than live and be a slave." I stood there in the cold wind, feeling degraded in comparison with their fierce purity. But then I felt my baby kick. I pressed my hand hard against my belly, and I was glad I'd chosen life. I turned for one last look at the mound. I thought, suppose Achilles is granted eternal glory in return for his early death under the walls of Troy. What will they make of us, the people of those unimaginably distant times? One thing I do know, they won't want the brutal reality of conquest and slavery. They won't want to know we were living in a rape camp. No, they'll go for something altogether softer. A love story, perhaps. I just hope they managed to work out who the lovers were. His story. His, not mine. It ends at his grave. Alcimus is here now. I have to go. Alcimus, my husband. A bit of a fool, perhaps, but as Achilles said, a good man. So I turned my back on the burial mound and let him lead me down to the ships. Once, not so long ago, I tried to walk out of Achilles' story and failed. Now, my own story can begin.